Oh, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Lima Online, Lima's weekly online series in which we look at actual topics in the field of media art, but always through the lens of Lima's so-called signature historical awareness. Today is actually quite a special event because we celebrate the opening of our very first online Cultural Matter exhibition, which also means that I'm here together with my dear fellow curator, Jan Robert Leegte. Hey, Jan Robert.
Hi, that's so nice. Thanks for introducing me.
Thanks for being here. And maybe you can tell a little bit about what Cultural Matter is and what it has become within this online framework.
Yes, Cultural Matter we started about 2 years ago, which is centered around a singular digital artwork, which really sort of pushes the limits of art. And we take that as a sort of case study to do a show, first of all, to translate it to the physical space. We'll talk more about that later. And we make 2 events around it. So we usually start with a talk with a guest speaker, and then we have a follow talk to dive sort of deeper into the topic of the work. So one work and a lot of sunlight on top, and all with the aim to sort of, unlock the discussion on digital art, which still is needed, and there's still so much to be discovered. And for this time, we have Rafaël Rozendaal.
Yes. And I think we should first maybe reveal the exhibition, but showing you a bit what we have. I'm gonna shortly share the link with you, but I think for now, it's best maybe if we look at it collectively. We have a walkthrough done by Jan Robert, in which you can see what the exhibition entails and how it functions. So what do you think, Jan Robert? Should we just go to that?
I think that will be an excellent idea. Okay. Briefly, I'll read very short. Oh no, I'll explain it in the video, right? Yes, so we made an online show. Here it comes.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the online show of Rafaël Rozendaal. This show has been developed for the series of Cultural Matter. Just to briefly introduce this, we got in contact with Rafaël Rozendaal at the beginning of the year, and we asked him to participate in our series. And our series always consists of a physical exhibition and 2 talks or 2 events. So, first of all, we started, Sanneke Huisman and I both curate this series. We both selected 5 works each. It consists in total of 10 works, which we wanted to show in the gallery space. Sanneke selected 5 sort of a formal art historical sort of relevance. She was interested in seeing how they reach back to the suprematists of the Russian avant-garde and how the sort of use of color and abstract, simple geometric forms, how they relate back to art history. And I selected 5 sort of based on a certain level of suppressed emotion you could find both in the title and in the quirky way of animation, like if you take, for instance, Deep Sadness or Falling. They have this heaviness over them, but they're, of course, also in these extremely bright colors. So I wanted to select some of those works. Originally, we wanted to show these works in the gallery space, and the idea was to have multiple screens, loads of them, and really sort of flood it in this very this heavy experience of all these works happening simultaneously. Well, and then of course COVID-19 came, and we had to change our whole strategy. So the whole program went online, and Rafaël was, of course, the first artist in which this happened. At first, so we approached him, would he be interested in doing an online show? At first he was quite hesitant. He was like, well, my work already is online. You can basically just go to my website to see my work. So how could this be valuable to do an online show? And so we looked further, and at a certain point he said, I have an idea. I actually do see a way out of this, and it's based on recent experiments I've been doing in the gallery spaces, in which I show an array of screens which show the same work. So it's separate, different instances of the same work at once. I can remember that myself when he was in a show by Karen Archie, Freedom of Movement, in the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam. I remember Rafaël Rozendaal had an array of, I think, 5 screens, which would all show the same work, which was quite impressive, and was also wondering why he did it. So we talked more about this, and what he found refreshing about this is because he's very interested in generative movement or animation, in contrast to linear video. Linear video has a fixed time. It is, of course, always the same sequence, and procedural animation is endless and is sort of bound to rules, but it's always different. And he said the only way to really experience that is to have to view parallel instances of the same work, and you can see how diverse the expression of the work is. Voila, that's what we did. So that led to this site. We are showing the 10 works within this website you can see currently, and 4 instances are run whenever you click on one of the works at the bottom. I'll just briefly run through a couple. As you can see, some are still interactive. They're sort of referencing to the actual websites. They've been captured as iframes. And some contain some audio. You can see this one, for instance, if you tap the first one, you can hear the audio. We disabled the audio on the other one, so you can hear the sound of one, but observe them how they work together. And as you can see, it is really quite refreshing, because like this work, Deep Sadness, it really becomes this language of different colors and forms. And again, if you click on them, you can activate the inherent sounds running behind them. I wish you much fun in our show. You can find it at rafaelrozendaal.ly-ma.nl, and under CM you can find more information about the show. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, that is the exhibition. Hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I shared the link in the chat. I will share it on the website and so on. So please feel free to explore it yourself, because it's always different. That's what happens with generative art. I see in the chat that you're already maybe waiting for someone else instead of me and Jan Robert. So Jan Robert, what are we going to do next?
Yes, we have invited Christiane Pol over. We always look for a specific match to have our artist interviewed with, and so in this case we would have Christiane Pol over in Amsterdam. We had everything so well organized, and we're really looking forward. Then of course all this happened, but thank God we can speak online. So Christiane Pol, among many things, a curator at the Whitney Museum in New York, an educator at the New School. She is a writer and lecturer, written extensively about art and technology. And of course, we have Rafaël Rozendaal, the invited artist, whose artistic practices comprise of websites, installations, print, and writing. He's a podcaster, a curator. You can remember him for his screensaver show he did, and the creator of the BYOB exhibition format. Well, let's go to the talk.
Let's go to the talk. And just as you know, afterwards, we will all still be here to answer your questions by chat. You will see the four of us, and Rafaël will be joining in the chat, but that's for later. I would say, indeed, for now, enjoy the talk.
Okay, good evening, and thanks so much for inviting me to this talk. I'm very excited to have another conversation with Rafaël. We've had a few, actually. So my first question to you, Rafaël, is your exhibition for Cultural Matter obviously has been moved from a physical to an online space, so you had to reconfigure everything. Could you talk a little bit about the process of the transition and how the curatorial concept may have changed and how you arrived at this particular selection of work?
Yeah, it's funny because also this talk changed at the same moment. So that what we're doing right now was planned to be in person in Amsterdam with an audience of maybe 40 to 60 people. And now we have access to a worldwide audience. So that's kind of a better version of the talk in that sense, because it's very hard to record talks. And so the same way we were thinking about the exhibition, how to bring that online. Because all my work is already created for the browser. So the initial idea was there's the hallway of Lima and there's an exhibition space, and we would have the same work on 4 screens. And the idea being that if you make an algorithmic work, every time you run it, it's a little bit different. So that's hard to understand for a lot of people. If they just see a monitor with a random work, it could be a video. And even if I show my work to people who are not so familiar and I just show it in the browser, it's hard to explain what is randomness. And so in this exhibition, we made a layout where it's kind of the emulation of 4 screens on a wall, and you see the same website 4 times, and you see that the script is making different decisions in the 4 instances. And we made a selection of 10 works. So it's really an interface similar to what I've done in physical exhibitions, and it's really to emphasize the idea that it's a programmed moving image and not a linear moving image. And I hope that showing this we're not trying to educate people, but make people feel what randomness is. That's really, for me, I think if people see this and they've seen those works before, perhaps maybe they're familiar with my work. But now, to me, there's an ongoing relationship with the audience. So they might have seen this installation in the Stedelijk Museum or in Korea or another place, and then they can experience it again online, and maybe they're more focused at home. So to me, it's very similar to music, that you might hear music the first time on the radio in a supermarket, and then you might see it at a festival, and then you see it at home, and all those instances build a familiarity, and then you start noticing details that you didn't notice before. You start feeling energy that you didn't notice before. So in that sense, this exhibition is an online translation of a physical idea, and I think the home experience is in a way more focused and more intimate than in a museum. So in a museum, you might feel an anxiety of other people behind you, and maybe you want to spend more time. It's different per person, but some people prefer seeing art at home.
Mm-hmm. I also think that the conceptual setup and experience profoundly changes. As a curator, I always have the problem that you're mentioning. When I bring net art or generative software art into a museum space, people very often just think, oh, it's a video playing.
Yeah.
So for a curator, it's very hard to translate that. And I think what you have been doing is a very clever conceit to actually point out that this is generative and the scripts change.
Yeah, and I think there's been a history of generative process-based abstraction, even in painting or sculpture. And there as well, if you don't read the text that comes with it, you wouldn't be aware that this was made by chance and not a conscious decision of the artist. So there's always that element of bringing in unpredictability, and the process is very exciting while you're making it, but then when you show it, does the audience they don't have, it's not a matter of understanding, but do they feel that there's an unpredictability in the work?
Mm-hmm. And I think they're more inclined to feel that when they experience something online than in physical space, where they traditionally, just through the experience of art, have had another frame of reference. That being said, is the online exhibition now a direct translation of the same sites or projects, or did you also change the selection?
We changed some of the works a little bit. So sometimes I change the pace of works for an exhibition. I might slow them down or speed them up. And we removed sound on some pieces because it would be too much with 4 instances. So whenever I have an exhibition, there are some changes. You reduce, in this case, actually, the works become a lot smaller. You're used to seeing them full screen, and now they're smaller. So then I adjust the speed a little bit.
And how did you make the choice of the specific projects? I mean, looking at them, there seems to be a nice choreography inherent to it, or musical composition when it comes to time frames or even the visuals and how the generativity of it unfolds.
That was Jan Robert and Sonneke that made the selection.
Okay.
And they each chose 5 works and chose a certain direction. And then because we were talking about, my work is already online, so what can you add as an online exhibition? And I thought the first step is editing, because for a lot of people, there's maybe 120 websites of mine online, and that might be overwhelming. So I think the focus of curation is very... to me, it's very, I always like these sort of obvious examples, but it's the feeling when you've taken too many photos on your phone and there's so many that you can't find them anymore. And sometimes my work online, and a lot of online-based artists, they make so much work that for an audience, it's very overwhelming. So I think the role of the curator is to find a connection between a smaller number of works, and that makes a powerful collection.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really about reframing and recontextualizing. So you have become known for a very distinctive visual style in your net art projects, and really use the browser window as a kind of canvas for abstract pictorial spaces. So on the one hand, you reference painting and create this contained space, but then this painterly space is also very deeply informed by the digital vernacular and how we navigate an online environment. So how do you negotiate these different visual languages when you create a work?
Yeah, I think the visual language started out of a combination of growing up with the history of painting and growing up with the history of cartoons. So my father is an abstract painter, so he would be in the other room painting, and then the television would show Looney Tunes and Mickey Mouse, and so I was somewhere in between those two worlds. So I was always interested in moving images without narrative and without a beginning or an end. And when I started, it was more figurative and more based on the subject of the work. So the subject being a jello or a door or anything. And over the years, it became more abstract because I was more interested in the action than the subject. So I said before in an interview that I moved more from the idea of a noun to a verb. So if before it was, you see a website and you say that's blood, and then now you see a website and you say, oh, that's more of a feeling of collapse or things collapsing. And so when you start being more interested in an analysis of movement and interactivity, and the subject is not important anymore, you just arrive at abstract forms. Then that's the most efficient way to analyze movement. So it was all logical steps. It was all reduction of like, for each work is a step after the previous work. So I'm thinking, how do I translate the experience of a train ride into a browser? So you're sitting in the train and you're seeing the landscape pass by, and you could film it. You could hold a camera and just film the whole train ride for 3 hours and put that online. Or you can sort of make a more diagrammatic experience. And I think that's the word I'm looking for, that I make diagrams of because the computer is such a diagrammatic environment. When you think of code and when you're designing software, you start with a pencil. There's a famous drawing of when they first designed Twitter, and it was like text box, 140 characters, post, update, timeline. It's very diagrammatic, and that to me is very close to conceptual art when you're analyzing, okay, I did this many footsteps between Rome and Venice, and that becomes the work. So I always see that sort of programming is very close to conceptual art in my head. That all that being said, when you're looking for the most efficient visual language to analyze movement and interactivity, that's where I arrived. And I chose bright colors because they work on any screen. Especially in the beginning, projectors were not that good. So if you use very subtle colors that are close to each other, let's say you make a work and it's light blue, navy blue, gray blue, and you have an old projector, you don't see anything. They all look the same. So then I was like, okay, pure red, pure blue, pure green, and then as hard as possible. And then as far as shapes, and from the beginning, I wanted the work to be scalable. So I started off making linear animations, and you would have to make an animation that was 320 by 480 pixels, and it would already make your computer smoke. And then you would scale it up in the browser, show it full screen, and it was very blurry, and the connection was slow. So I thought, I have to make work that is really compact and can go through the network very quickly, and that's why vector graphics lent themselves to that. And they're scalable, and I think if you have a diagrammatic approach to composition, then you think more in lines than that you think the way a videographer thinks in terms of a sequence of very rich images. So everything, just all that being said, it was a natural affinity with simplicity, but then also technology pushed me in a certain direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think vector animation is really, it's so important in your work and so much characterizes your visual language. And what nicely comes together here are really the conceptual and practical aspects, of creating that type of work that is deeply diagrammatic, but then also brings a lot of attention to process. I always think of your work as very conceptual, Some people may find it formalist, but I think there is this deep conceptual level to it, in that it also highlights programmability. And as many artists working in this field have pointed out, there is this deep connection to conceptual art that starts with instructions, very often with language, and builds on that. And any type of software art does that too.
And computers are just machines to run instructions.
Yep. And building on that, staying with your web-based work for a moment, I also want to talk another aspect of practicalities, and that is that you've also become known for the way in which you delineated each work in the online environment and actually developed a way of selling net art. Not that net art hasn't been sold before you created it, but you really managed to establish a model that many other people lean on. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the first step was that I was making a lot of online experiments, and I think a lot of people were, and they always felt like, oh, there's a file on my computer, and now I put the file on the server. But it didn't feel like a website until I put it in a domain name. So if I had done neorafael.com/this work, that work 1, 2, 3 until somehow it felt like those URLs could change, the work might be lost, and there is a permanence to domain names that before thinking about selling, that was one of the things. If you think of blog posts, they disappear after a while or they change. And so there was a lot of coders and people online sharing experiments that disappeared later. And I think the gesture of a domain name is saying, I'm investing money for this work to always be here, and the money symbolizes that the work is finished. It's not an experiment. It's not a sketch that when you start coding, it's very easy to just do version 5B, 5C, version 6.3.1, and before you know it, your whole drive is full of unfinished works. Same with the idea of taking digital photos, and you just have thousands of them. So the domain name was really there as a barrier to say this is a finished work. And then it also was interesting to me that the title of a work is also the location of a work. That if you think of a famous title like the Mona Lisa, it doesn't imply where that work is. But if you think of a website, you just have to remember the name and you can always find the work. So I found that interesting. And all that being said, then domain names are one of the few scarce things in the digital space. Everything else is infinitely abundant. So that made it a sellable thing, and that kind of grew organically. And as I sold a few more, I developed a contract together with a lawyer. I looked at other artists who would have a contract selling video art, mostly for the reasons that if you sell a painting or a sculpture, it's pretty clear the transfer of the object is the transfer of ownership. And with digital media, it's not as clear, so I felt like some kind of written guideline would be helpful. And then I decided to make that contract public to encourage other artists. And all this came from a frustration when I was in art school that I wanted to see the history of interactive art, and it was very hard to access. So I felt like if you make computer art, it should be available on the network for others to grow for the next generation.
Mm-hmm. I think it was an incredibly clever step to tie the work to the domain name. As you said, domain names were actually also a scarce commodity. When I went on the World Wide Web in the early days, all of my artist friends were doing domain name speculation, and some of them made actually hundreds of thousands of dollars on it if they were clever enough to hit the right ones. And then, of course, being involved in the museum world and also acquiring work and working with galleries, collectors have always asked over the years, but what does it mean if I own it? The idea of hosting and the idea of a domain name is so important to this. And most artists would just have their work as a subdomain on their site, which then basically charged the collector with, do I get a domain name for this? Do I load this onto my server? What if I don't have it? So this whole transaction and delineation and treating the domain name as part of the commodity, I think really was a game changer for many people who weren't as familiar with doing that. I also want to touch upon another aspect of your work, and that is the changing materiality of projects and how you translate them from the online to the physical or the other way around. This is very often subsumed under this, for me, dubious label of the post-digital, which I have huge problems with the post-digital as a label for numerous reasons, and temporality being one of them. But I think what this term, whether you like it or not, really captures is a certain return to materiality among younger artists, partly due to technological possibilities, but also due to the fact that our whole environment is now so deeply infiltrated by network technologies, and you see their aesthetics at work in the objects surrounding you. And you also have very much become known for translating works such as into time, into very different installation environments and manifestations. Can you talk a little bit more about what inspired that process, how you work it, which works you choose to translate or not, and how you deal with the gallery space?
Yeah, I think the first step was to project websites. That was the most obvious thing when I had my first exhibitions. So there was just a few exhibitions, just one straight projection. But then quickly you start thinking, what else is possible? So that's really the ongoing question, what else is possible? So I started showing websites more as a surrounding, where I cover the floor with broken mirrors and repeat a website, so it really becomes a spatial experience more than just, and there's no clear answer that one way is better or the other. So I every time I see a space, I think about a new way of doing it. And then moving to the physical projects, it often happened by accident that I was invited to do an exhibition, and they had a sponsor to do a lenticular invitation card. So it's one of those cards that changes if you change your viewing angle. So they said, do you want to make an image for just send us 4 frames. And we made some tests, and I had a few that were more figurative, so and they would look kind of clumsy. The animation is not as smooth as on. So that's often when you translate. You start with an idea, you think this is possible on the screen, and then you go to another medium and you find out that it doesn't work. So I did the Jello, and it just didn't feel like a wobbling Jello because it's only 4 frames and it's kind of blurry. And then I tried some more abstract compositions, and then the blurriness became the work, that the shortcoming of the medium was actually very interesting. So I started it off as a postcard, and in a kind of post-internet way, as you say, the digital infiltrates everything. I made the postcard, I was very excited, and I had it on my kitchen table, and I make a little film, and I share it on Instagram, and a friend of mine who had collected my website said, oh, this is great, maybe I can buy the first one, and then you can make it in a bigger size. So it was that sort of community and open studio on the internet that made the work possible. And then you go from there, and behind me you see a tapestry that's based on a browser plugin. And I was making the plugin, but I was also doing a residency in Turkey, and they said, do you want to make works with local craftspeople? And I said, oh, I'm very interested in textile because it's a rule-based system and it's systematic. And they said, yeah, we know this weaving studio that you can work with. So things started there, just being there and seeing what's possible. So I do think that a lot of these artists that start out digital and then move to physical things, it's a lot about having access to that, where you start out on the computer. I always thought of the computer as a very humble studio, and you could say that most people have to have a computer for work or anything else. And so in that sense, it's a free material. It's really, there's no cost to making a GIF animation. And that's how you start out. But then as you start building momentum and community, then you start thinking, oh, maybe I can explore this medium and maybe I can explore that medium. And the interesting thing for me is then encountering Materiality and seeing that it has a very different character, different from what you thought you would do. So with these tapestries, my first instinct was, oh, I choose the threads and that will be the color. But then it turned out you can't just fill an area with one color. You have to mix 3 colors at the same time, and that creates a different color sensation. And then you're experimenting, and the work becomes different than you intended. But in the accidents that happen in the factory and in the manufacturing that make the work.
Mm-hmm. I want to unwrap that a little bit. First of all, I really like the process of the accidental or context specificity of, evolving a work. Here you have an opportunity and access to a certain kind of technology, or here someone asks you to do a postcard, and from that emerges a whole series of work. So I like that very opportunity-oriented style of emergence and work. What I really like about the lenticulars, which I think are incredibly successful, is that they are such a beautiful way of translating perspective and the movement of interactivity into the human body. So very often what you do with the mouse while visiting one of your websites, and influencing graphic shapes, in the gallery space you do with your body, changing the perspective in front of the lenticular and capturing a similar effect. So they're on the one hand distinctly different, but they also beautifully manifest, I think, this kind of interactivity that you seldom get within the gallery space, where you don't use your body to navigate a piece. I also want you to talk a little bit more about abstract browsing from a different angle. I mean, we already talked about the fact that your work is so much rooted in painterly abstraction, but what you did with abstract browsing is also introducing this element of machine vision and how basically the machine or the computer sees or designs in terms of web design. I mean, one of the very well-known pieces in abstract browsing is just the Google search engine interface. And we look at it and we immediately recognize that interface, but I think you once pointed out that nobody who wants to do good design would ever design something like that. It's off in so many different ways, but it becomes iconic and it's a completely different process. Can you talk a little bit more about that impulse behind abstract browsing?
Should I start with the lenticulars?
Sure.
Yeah. And with the lenticulars, what is interesting is that when you design an interactive software, you start with instructions and then decide how much control does the user have. And with lenticulars, all you can do as far as an instruction is give 4 frames. So at that point, the computer cuts them up into thin stripes, and then there's an optical mixing of the 4 frames as you're moving your body, but you don't have a lot of control. It's really, so I always compare lenticulars a bit to painting in a dark room for 10 minutes, then you have to leave, and then they turn the lights on and you can see the work, but you have no idea what you made. And after making a few more and a few more, you start to realize certain colors after each other create a certain movement. But there's this idea of a lack of control that's very interesting, similar in abstract browsing. And what I find interesting also with the lenticulars is that the 4 frames are an instruction, and then the lens mixes them optically, but the outcome is really infinite. There's so many, because it's basically an analog mixing, so there's no, the amount of outcomes is really infinite. It's as you're standing in the room and the time of day and the light, there's so many, and I like that there's this parallel with the screen being this mesmerizing thing. If you're sitting in a restaurant and you just can't take your eyes off of the TV hanging there, even if you don't want to look, it just has this magnetism. So that's one of the things of the screen that I wanted to capture, but not in a screen. So I always see them as, they are computers, but non-electronic. So they're constantly running the software of the 4 frames, but they're mixing them in an analog way, not in a digital way. And then the abstract browsing plugin really was a way of almost seeing the browser as a lens to code. Like, so the browser is a camera that is capturing code and putting a filter between you and the code. And it really started with not many intentions, just to see what happens. And it's once again one of those things. I was developing the software with my programmer, and we had to decide what's the smallest item that the program will still render, because it's not going to render really small single pixels. So we had to decide on a minimum. And in my head, I imagined something like New York Times would be one big field and then a headline and then a block, and you start rendering it, and it was much busier than I expected. So that was my first shock, that the internet was much more detailed than I thought. So I was like, can we make it more simple so it feels more like my work? But then after a while, I started accepting the chaos. And so that's one of those things that you move towards the material. You don't make the material move towards you. So as I was browsing, I started analyzing my own browsing behavior. So I surf the web as usual. Anyone can download the plugin for free. It's abstractbrowsing.net. And at the end of the day, I go through my browsing history and see if I visited websites that I didn't visit before. So, and then say, oh, what does New York Times look like? What does the Wall Street Journal look like? What does Facebook look like? And it's a little bit like seeing the diagrams of a building. So, and then as time went on, I just kept surfing in different ways and surfing at different aspect ratios, different screen sizes. And it's really a diagrammatic analysis of information. And as you said, one of those things about the internet is that the big websites are not designed by humans. They're partially initiated by humans, but then they start learning and they start listening and looking, what are we doing? Where are we clicking? And then they start A/B testing. So if Facebook decides, let's make the banner a little bit bigger so people click more on the ad. And then it turns out if the ads are too big, people don't come back. So let's make it a little bit smaller. So they're constantly moving things around in different regions of the world and listening. So I always thought that the traditional idea of abstraction is to make ideas that come from within and give them a shape. And in abstract browsing, the compositional ideas are not coming from me, they're coming from the world and from machines listening to the world. So in a sense, traditionally, abstract painting is about conscious decisions and deciding what's beautiful, and abstract browsing is more about deciding what's efficient. So the computer is constantly deciding what's the most efficient solution for this composition.
Yeah, I very much like how the diagrammatic plays out in that particular work, and what you just talked about, and then also, as you already mentioned, how it ties that exploration back to the beginning of computing, because the Jacquard loom, which was created in 1801, I think, of course, is often mentioned as one of the origins of programmability, and developing pattern. Yeah. So another question I have for you is how you feel your work has evolved over time. I have not seen all of your exhibitions. I've seen many of the catalogs, and I've been to all of your solo shows at Postmasters Gallery here in New York. And the exhibitions all had a very distinctly different flavor. I mean, there's always this underlying framework for your explorations and how you approach work, but how you worked, for example, in one of the later shows with negative spaces in this form of sculptural painting, or your haikus, they're all distinctly different. So can you talk a little bit about the evolution of your work?
Yeah. I think it's not, when you're making the work, I always talk about falling in love with an idea. So let's say I was in art school, I was trying all kinds of materials. I was doing photography and silk screening and drawing and painting. And you're just trying stuff. And then I found the computer and I fell in love with that. So it was just drawn to it. And then it's undeniable that that's the direction. And then as time goes by, I start working on tapestries and I think, oh, this is so interesting. And there's so many things I can do here that I couldn't do on the screen. Or I start working with. And then the haiku was something that I'm always thinking about efficiency and reducing work in my life. And it's sort of the pure conceptual. And I arrived at haiku as this form of generating an image in someone's mind with language as code. So, and then the next show was about these shapes cut out of metal, these sculptural paintings, where I was thinking about the absence of an image creates the image, and translating the idea of. Basically, what I'm saying is every 1 or 2 years, I arrive at a new idea and fall in love with it, and then suppress all the other work, all the other series, and then I think this is the solution. And then a few months later, a new idea happens. And sometimes I think a lot of artists have this decision, should I stick to one medium and go very deep with that, or should I go from one idea to the other to the other? For me, there's always a lot of simultaneous series going on. I never stopped making websites. And that was one of those hesitations. I think a lot of digital artists, they have a hesitation when they move from the screen to other media, that there's the concept, am I doing this because I want to or because I think it will make money?
Yeah.
And so both can be true at the same time. And then the idea is like, if I move to poetry, will people laugh at me because it's like amateur? And every time you make a step, you're wondering, am I doing this because I'm looking for some sort of confirmation or success, or am I doing it because of my own interest and because the work needs to exist? So and I think Postmasters, more than other galleries even, is a gallery where I like to try new things and make the first gesture of a new series. And I think they're very open to any idea and they don't edit me. So it just happens that every time in New York, I use that as a sort of key moment to launch a new idea. But it gets to the point where you get to the question, why do I make what I make? And then that question is unanswerable. There's no other answer than curiosity, that I'm curious and then I want the work to exist. So that's the most honest answer. But then after analyzing all that and talking to other people about my work, I think I'm attracted to systems and then test systems. So the system of the haiku or the system of a silhouette cut out of a piece of metal. There are all these rule-based systems that then within that system I can start exploring. And maybe my definition, or one of the definitions of art, is when a personality meets a material. And so for me, it's interesting to try different materials and see how will this material respond to me and how will I respond to that material.
Yeah. And to me, the evolution of your work always has looked very natural, because there is an underlying system to even that, I think, which speaks to your fascination with systems, even if the works are very different and they tie back to ideas that you've always explored, whether that's abstraction in language, and the haiku certainly is, one example of the most stripped down essential form of poetry and of the use of language, or the way you manifest other ideas. And I think what you pointed out here is also how important the gallery environment or art world environment is to nurturing certain kind of practices, because so many artists have come to me also and have said, oh, should I turn this into an object to make money? And I always say, just don't bend over backwards and, violate the work in order to make it sellable within a gallery context. So that's unfortunately a practical aspect that is very real to artistic practice, and to curatorial practice. So a couple more questions I have. Has your practice changed during quarantining and isolation and this time of the pandemic, or is it life as usual? Many artists are saying, well, I'm working at home anyway, so.
Yeah, I saw a meme of most annoying people during quarantine, and one of them was like the prepper who has a lot of face masks, and one of the annoying people was the artist who said, oh, I've been doing this for 20 years, it's no big deal. So in a strange way, a lot of exhibitions are postponed, and then this exhibition we had to change the idea. But I do feel like, because I'm a net-based artist and I do make physical works, but I work with factories that I don't even have to go to. There's not much difference, but there is a slowing down that was kind of needed. I think there's no traveling now, and so I have more time to develop new ideas and sketches. So I feel more focused, and I wouldn't want this state to go on forever, but I think for a lot of people it was a nice reset moment to really focus on the core of creating and sitting and thinking of ideas.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a reset moment for the world. And that's a
this is speaking from a privileged position, that I'm not at financial risk and I don't have to take on a job that I don't want or be evicted or things like that. But I do think that the art world was headed in a direction that was embracing almost a Hollywood scale that was not necessary. It wasn't making the contemplative experience better. If museums are overcrowded and if there's so much travel required, and you hop from art fair to art fair where the work is not really in a good condition to see, it's too busy. So I think there were a lot of aspects of this acceleration of the art world that were detrimental to the concentration of contemplative observation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it remains to be seen if things will fundamentally change when we go back to a new kind of world. So one final question, what are you working on right now? Have you fallen in love with a new idea? Or
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't show it yet. But I've been making a lot of... So when I make websites, I start off with a sketchbook. I'll grab it. So the idea of websites came after I had been making animations. It's not because I encountered the computer. So the first 10, 12 years, any idea I would have would be a moving image idea. So the idea, oh, there's a hand and you can touch the fingers, and what does that mean for the representation of a hand? Or shapes are falling down in a downward movement. But it was always a moving idea. And now as I'm sketching, my ideas always start with like this. So just diagrams, and I think like, oh, these can start rotating or whatever. But as I make these drawings, they start out like this, and then I move to the computer. And then more and more I would make an idea and I think, I don't know how this should move. The sketch is good as it is. And so I'm at the point where maybe before 1 out of 10 sketch ideas was a still and 9 were moving, and now it's more half and half. So I'm still making moving images, and now I'm looking for the next material to take these sketches. And so I've been working with laser cutting different kinds of plastic, and also working with baked enamel and sort of looking. But this is not the real way it will be, but sort of I'm expanding on that, trying different kinds of materials. So I think with abstract browsing and the lenticulars, there was a computational process, and here there's not a computational sort of process of how I arrive at the composition. It's just the websites were a framework, and then within that framework, no one ever asked me, why did you make this one? Why did you make that one? Because the framework is so new. So then I've always been a bit nervous about taking those sketches that are purely from me and not from a computational process, but I'm slowly moving towards that.
That's interesting. Yeah. So basically, stripping it down even further and concentrating on the intrinsics of the composition and the system. It's going to be interesting to see. Yeah, I don't know if there is anything else you wanted to bring up in our conversation.
No, I think this will go on YouTube, and we will answer questions there, and so there'll be audience questions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's make it live and take questions from the audience. Thank you so much for your time, and once again for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you for your questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Christiane and Rafaël, for this interesting talk. And thank you even more for joining us here in the screen. You can see we're all nicely together here. Just to explain briefly, Rafaël is there. He's really there. He's real, but he won't talk. So he's in a place where he can't talk. So he will answer your questions in the chat. And as you can see, the discussion has already started, but I think we want to go back to the first question that Rafaël already tried to answer or answered, but maybe we can dig a little deeper. Christiane, do you want to say something, add something, ask something to Rafaël in regard to this?
Yeah, I loved Rafael's answer about you need to care about the work, which is still one of the big issues. So there's absolutely no doubt that net art pieces and Rafael's pieces will disappear, quote unquote, at some point. I have commissioned by now over 100 works for the Whitney's Artport website, and many of them are not functional anymore. I think preservation over the past 2 decades has made enormous progress. I would actually say that preservation of digital art is way ahead of collection of digital art in museums. So there is, as of yet, I think, not enough care or interest in those objects there to actually bring them into collections and make that commitment. So we have preservation strategies ranging from storage to emulation to migration to recreation, and every work would need to be approached in a different way. I would also, and I actually think I saw Annette Deckard in the attendance of this talk, who is an expert in that field. I would think that Rafael's work is actually a little easier to preserve than other ones, just due to its very nature and more easily recodable. But it's a huge topic we could talk about for hours.
Hey, let me ask a question. Rafaël, or both, as one is in chat and one is live in screen. We spoke briefly about the domain name model. I would like to just go slightly deeper into it in sort of realism, also from personal experience. I think I saw it very much as a educational move. It really was a way to sort of get people to take net art serious. So apart from the very practical points I heard, I must correct me if I'm wrong, but I have noticed over the years now, but probably 10 years after the introduction of this model, or that many collectors or musea don't even transfer the domain name. They happily leave it at the artist. It seems to be a state that has transitioned by now, and has been. You see artists go back to subdomains. It seemed more like an emancipationary move. And that being said, talking about collecting and preserving the domain name, there seems to be a sort of care you mentioned, but it's also sort of collecting net art is very carefree, because you commit yourself financially to it, but the artist keeps the domain, it keeps the files on the server, keeps maintaining it. So it's a very carefree way of collecting. Do I see something? Do I miss something here?
Well, yes and no. I would definitely say that attitudes towards collecting have changed, in that there isn't the obsession with the original that you would have with physical objects anymore. I think it's also very generational, because if I talk to very young people, this whole idea of the original versus the copy is kind of vanishing. They don't care that much about that aspect anymore. Of course, the model of, the artist is maintaining, etc., works only as long as the artist is alive, and also makes a commitment in a kind of contract to keeping the work in place, which is a tricky thing. I mean, just think about how often people move around them. So that can very easily become problematic. When it comes to the pieces we have commissioned for the Whitney's Artport website, many artists still have them on their site. But even if we link to a site, we make sure that we have the files on the server. One of the mantras of preservation of net art and digital art in the early 90s was distribute or die. Keeping as many copies as possible on as many servers as possible. But I agree with you that attitudes have changed. I still think that Rafael's model holds a lot of value as a conceptual one too.
Mm-hmm.
And Rafael, a bit related to this, I have a question for you, because I know here at Lima you did a documentation video of all your website you had made until that day, which was showing like how the works were functioning at that very date on the current technology that was available, which shows a sort of care of the work in its time and the way the interaction was at the moment you made it. And how do you feel about like the browsers that keep on updating and the interaction that might slightly change, the aesthetic that might slightly change? Like, how do these two coincide in your practice? Maybe that's a very long question to answer by chat. Can I make it more binary? I don't know. Shorter question, yeah. Do you care a lot about the aesthetic and the interaction of the work at the moment you made it? Like, is there an original interaction with the work, so to say? Since the documentation, I show the bit that.
It's becoming a performative Q&A.
Yeah.
But that's a good reminder. If you ask a question, do it like for Rafael, make something you can just answer yes or no.
You can always bounce two questions to us respectively, and then we switch from one to the next.
That's true. Maybe like we should now have one for you.
Two parallel tracks.
I know in a way that the documentation question is also something you might be confronted with working at an art institute. Like, how do you see the two of them like coincide, so to say?
Yeah, I think documentation is always a step in preservation too. And coincidentally, Annette Decker has really written about when documentation enters the work itself. Like Jody has done a few pieces, and I know you talked to them, I think, where the documentation of a work actually entered the work and became part of it. Yeah. I think obviously the interaction at the moment when the work was created is kind of defines an intent. If you would recreate that work later, you would probably slow down or whatever it takes to get to that level again, which is a common problem also in preservation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So as Rafaël says, higher frame rate and resolution are actually crucial in that process too.
Absolutely. No, but it's just because he did like make this documentation video that also shows a care of how the work was, of course, at that very time, but also with the awareness that it might change again over time. So I think these two, but it easily starts to question the status of a work, which is also so interesting, of course, in the field of digital art by definition. Yeah. I think there's another question for you, but maybe it's already being answered because I also don't catch up everything that happens simultaneously.
It's going to be a parallel thing. Maybe I'll ask Christiane another one. I kind of like to hear her opinion on actually Rafael's point so the idea of the show we created and Rafael proposed was to show instances of the same work. And the point he wanted to make is that a lot of people miss the magic of a procedural work and sort of confuse them with an animation, a linear animation. That seems like a sort of also a classic misconception within media art. Is there anything you as a curator, how do you deal with this?
You really have to come up with strategies of liveness. And I think what Rafaël has done or proposed is a really clever strategy, and that is showing multiples or having, let's say, different stations for one work to actually make clear that, oh, here is not an animation just running, but clearly those instances are off. What I also noticed within exhibitions, as mundane and ridiculous this may seem, there always is an in-crowd who has an understanding of the medium and starts messing with it. When I showed one of Mark Napier's pieces, Riot, at the Whitney Museum, the people who knew what it was started just typing in URLs of porn sites, all day long, And within the museum, that made it very clear that this was a live site, but led to all kinds of discussions with the education department. What do we do? Do we censor? Do we leave this open? That's another aspect of liveness within the museum space. But I think somehow you have to come up, or at least try to come up with strategies that make this real-time nature of the work clear. Otherwise, it falls flat. Yeah.
And then in the meantime, Rafa is going full force in the chat. I really feel like I'm this is a match, and I have to look at all the players that are involved. But yeah, I think everyone who is there can read that. But Christiana, I don't know if you also see it. So
I'm actually thinking about parts of the conversation and Simpson's question about when one considers a piece finished, or if one would go back to rework it. And of course, Rafaël may have his own approach to that, but it's something that also comes up very often. And at the Whitney, for example, we came to the conclusion that we have to think about a work as having a digital life, that artists actually return to it sometimes and change it without there being any preservation issues. So we have a GitHub repository where we record changes of pieces, because sometimes artists come and ask precisely that. Oh, I did this piece with AI services and bots, but they have improved so much, I want to use different ones. Can I change the work? And we don't want to say no to that, but then kind of incorporate those changes and keep track of it in a GitHub repository.
Yeah, in a way that is slightly related to all types of media arts. Lima takes care of a big collection of video artworks, and we often receive new scans of a work that was made. So if technology improves, artists want to and that can either be the Preserving Institute taking care of that, but it can also be on behalf of the artist saying I want to take back my tape file or whatever and slightly adjust it in accordance to current technologies. So I think that's there's also continuation going on there already since the 60s and 70s, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Also reminds me, briefly of, it's also, that's the conservation side, but there's also the artistic side of dealing with the performative nature of code, in a way of coding. I have to think of Jody, who are they finish a work and it goes in solid concrete. They just never touch a single character of the code. Whereas if I think of Damon Zucconi, he constantly updates his work. And he sort of is very clear about that. So it's also an artistic choice, which makes it even more complicated.
Yeah. Although Jody have done it too with Jet Set.
Yeah, of course. They don't say that.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to what Rafaël is going to say about.
Yeah, I think he's working on the Robert Hamilton question.
I actually very much like coming to the question of Rafael's reductive approach and whether it's a strategy or a subversive response to online graphics. I really like that approach in that it gets to the core of aesthetics or aesthetic elements within an online space that you typically only see explored in a painterly context, or very often. There are very few people who actually take the experimentation with figurative compositions to that essential level, and I really think that was something that was very much needed for the medium of online art. Yeah. So, and as Rafael says, there is this idea of also basics of game design, that is at the core of that.
Which make me think it's quite interesting, because this abstraction is the basis of game design, but it was a sort of the end point of painting, so to say. So it's interesting how these two coincide.
Yeah, and the reductive effect of Rafael not talking definitely adds to this conversation.
It does add an interesting element, for sure. Fits his line of work, for sure. Any more comments, questions, also from you, Christiane? Rafael? No? I think we...
No, the chat keeps rolling, which is cool. And just sit back and observe the chat.
Yeah, and while we're waiting to see, maybe something is still happening in the chat, we might already slightly announce next week's edition, Jan Robert.
Good idea.
Because next week will also be an event within the framework of this exhibition. And
Yeah, we always do it in twofold. We have a concept conversation and a talk, as we said in the beginning. So for next time, we invited Michael Connor from Rhizome, and we invited him to talk about his knowledge on curating online. So it's basically doing online shows with sort of net-based art, a very specific corner, and something which has been very prevalent in the last 6-7 weeks, and having a sort of a rebirth. And of course, we were forced to do an online show with Rafaël, so we thought it'd be fitting for Michael to ask Michael to reflect on this. And he said, I have a lot to say. So he'll be here next week at 8 o'clock, probably, saturating us with online ideas and also future prospects of how to make online exhibitions, curate online.
In the meantime, I see some interesting stuff going on over there. Have digital graphics become a sort of common language, something universal that transcends spoken language? Very nice point, and I think it's already being answered by Rafaël.
Yeah, and I would very much agree with Rafaël that it is a language of its own that works across borders. I also have my doubts whether it's universal. You need literacy to understand that kind of language, and from my experience, we're still far away from having that universal literacy. But that is not different from anything else. People have literacies in very different areas and corners of the world, but it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, and the intersection of linguistics and net art is, of course, very evident already there.
Yeah.
So there's another question for Rafaël, but he's probably answering it. Oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Which is also an interesting question.
It's nice to have there's this fixed partnership with a fixed coder, really grown together.
Yeah. And I actually also have seen that over the years with many artists who are coders and can write their own code, but also as they move to different stages of their career, it almost becomes a necessity to outsource and develop the concept and have someone implement it, because you're working on so many shows at the same time or need to produce new series of works. So it's an interesting relationship. Not that it's all new, but I think it's different from painters' assistants. implementing or doing the actual painting. I see a huge difference here. And yeah, I think Rafaël makes an interesting point in saying that if he codes himself, he approaches this differently or has different ideas about it. Yeah. So. This has become a collective reading session.
Yes.
I really like the pace of it. Like normally you're constantly talking when on a stream, and it's kind of nice to read together, to sit together. But
yeah. Get a break. Exactly. Have some time for reflection. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if anything, this crisis, the last 6-7 weeks, it's like all new modes of communication happening, like this weird video group reading live with feedback. I mean, there's so much weird stuff happening. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've been asked this last question about the current crisis, creating new opportunities for net art a lot. I'm a little skeptical about this. Right now, there's enormous interest in net art, and I've been so busy over the past weeks doing interviews, being on the radio, like Art Forum featured the last project we commissioned for Artport by Sam Lavini and Tiga Brain as their critics pick. And it's really great to see the medium getting so much attention. But I doubt that this will be sustained once we're back to physical exhibitions and net art will regularly be a critic's pick. I'm not so sure about that. Right now, net art has the privilege, and software art, to be the only art form that can be experienced in its native form, rather than as representation. And that, of course, brings a lot of attention to it. I think that's great from an educational perspective. I'm not so sure about this being a sustained interest once we're on the other side of this. But I'm enjoying the moment.
I happen to be slightly more positive. I think once people get acquainted with net art, they might get hooked and they might want it, like, also when we're fully back.
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so.
Maybe it's more a hope than a statement, but let's hope so.
Yeah. Well, I've seen it, or we all have seen it go through so many waves since it emerged. Absolutely. In the early 90s, waves of interest and of interest flattening. Yeah, so.
That's a good point that you make also, Rafaël, which means that like net art will still stay strong because we just like we'll all be in the countryside meeting still online after this crisis. Absolutely.
Yeah, net art certainly won't go away. It's the interest that goes up and down, as it does with other media too. Not sure if it was beach driven.
What we also can do is just run it on the Lima slide, and we can sit back and join the chat. You'll see.
So yeah, that means that's,
and then because the chat is going on, it would be a shame to.
Yeah, that's why we're still here. If we cut it, like this, the chat is gone. So we can just indeed put a nice little image over there, so that we can just like say bye here and meet back again in the chat. I think that's a good one.
Yes. Exactly.
Okay, so I think we say bye here and meet in the chat. Cross-platform meetup. Thank you so much, Christiane and Rafaël, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Let's.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.